Well, good evening to everybody. Welcome to Stygian Articles presented by the Lovecraft Tapes podcast. I am Jeremy, your keeper of arcane lore, and tonight I'm going to read scary fiction for you. Hope you're ready. Listener discretion is advised. The stories I read and write will often contain extreme horror, violence, language, and other adult themes. God forbid language. Watch and listen at your own risk. Now we begin Handy Longlegs by John Brownlee. I'm not sure if he pronounces it Brownlee or just Brownlee. Here we go. Everyone has that weird uncle growing up, don't they? The kind who tickles you until you cry. The kind who doesn't visit anymore. The kind no one in the family will talk about. The kind whose giggle is so high-pitched it can only be heard in the sound of your ear cells dying. The rickety-stickety kind, with hands like daddy Longlegs all tied together. Everyone has that kind of uncle, right? Mine was Uncle Handy. He came around when I was about 6. That borderland age some of us never wholly grow out of, when your perception is still more impressionistic than factual. That's probably why my memories of him feel so much more like dimly remembered dreams. The kind a shrink might finally coax out of you after dozens of therapy sessions, and which can't be repressed by the anxiety meds they prescribe. He was tall. I remember that. Thin, too. But that doesn't really convey the shivery, harvest man-like quality his silhouette had. Have you ever been to the theater when the front stage lights are set low before the stage? It elongates the performer's shadow behind them. Sink the light low enough, and it puts their outline on a stretching rack, making them appear as tall as you like. But imagine for a moment if it were possible to take that shadow, the stretched out one, and cast a light upon it from below the horizon of our world. What would its silhouette look like, standing in the backlit oblivion of your childhood doorway as you lay paralyzed with fear in your bed? A figure of sharpness and shadow, lankiness and length. Would it even appear human anymore? Or would it just be a fractal? Something with height and thinness so existential it had to fold itself through the doorway in segments to fit? Something with a head that was just a thickening, and whose smile was a leer somehow implied in a taut line of thread? Now, perhaps, you can picture Uncle Handy. I don't know how we were related. I think maybe he was my mother's brother, but I have no memories of him at family gatherings like Thanksgiving or Christmas. I somehow knew he lived in the country, but why he stopped coming around, I never learned. But he did come around. That I now remember. That my nerves still scream. Even 30 years later, sometimes when I see a figure backlit in a doorway at night, I remember his hand clamped over my mouth, the infinitely slender appendage of his forefinger hovering like a needle above my belly button, ready to tickle me down to the very core of my being. Tinglingly, it descends, wriggling in a wave between 1,000 sinuous joints, to probe my most sensitive places, where the nerves lay closest to the skin. Then I relive it. I feel his phantom digits in the flesh of my instep, the furrows of my ribs. As his filament fingers slide between atoms and find hidden reservoirs of sensation, I hold my breath and bite my tongue as he taught me. My lungs and ribs ache. My throat swells shut with tension. My eyes squeeze out tears until my lashes are crusted with salt. I gasp and I snivel and I wheeze, but I never laugh. Because in the release of laughter is the certain knowledge that Uncle Handy will take it as an invitation to do his worst, to take me to his house in the country, to show me across endless nights how transcendent tickling can be, how close a cousin it can come to pain. Everyone has that kind of uncle, right? My daughter Emily is the best thing in my life. I wouldn't hurt her in a million years. Her mom called it quits with me when she was still pregnant. She was my first and only girlfriend. The last straw for her was when I freaked out during some horseplay. She was just being silly, but I overreacted. And between that and all my anxiety, that was it. That was 6 years ago, but we're still friendly. Hey, I wouldn't marry me either. Besides, that was what got me to go to therapy, where I realized eventually it was all for the best. You can't share a bed with someone for long without accidentally tickling them in the middle of the night. And because of Uncle Handy, that's the kind of thing that I just can't stand. Anyway, once a month, Emily spends the whole weekend with me. This past weekend, I decided to load her into the car and drive 3 hours to see my folks. Since I confronted them about Uncle Handy, they've kept me a little bit at arm's length. But they pined for more time with their granddaughter. So when we got there, my mom had a whole special night of cookies and crafts planned out. I felt a little left out, but Mom said I should take the opportunity and catch up with some of my old high school friends. They all would be just fine together without me, she said. My buddies and I ended up going to that crummy dive we haunted in high school. I'm not supposed to drink because of my meds, so I mainly went for nostalgia. But at the end of the night, I had a couple beers. Not enough to get drunk, but it was still a mistake. I started feeling a little fuzzy and paranoid. While my buddy hung over me, using his fingers to tiptoe up and down my sternum as he told me some drunken story, my eyes caught someone silhouetted in the men's room doorway. It was nobody, but I freaked out a little bit. People got angry. I had to leave early. The shadows in the bar had started looking very thin and long. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. Emily was tucked up in my old bed, sleeping fitfully, so I went into the kitchen for a snack. All of her art stuff was still out on the table. I cracked open a Coke and looked idly at what she'd been drawing. Then I looked more closely. The can collapsed. Geysers of foam ran over my fist. Silhouetted against a bloom of lunar yellow, a wobbly black Crayola streak ran down the page. It was some kind of stick mane. Arms coming off him at angles. I think it's supposed to be a man. It was some kind of stick man. Arms coming off him at angles, fingers as long as his legs. He stood in front of a crazy house on a hill. And even if I hadn't recognized his bearing, his expression was unmistakable. Because in white crayon, my daughter had drawn a face over the imperceptible thickening of the figure's head, a manic smiley face, wider by far than the wisp of his skull. It was him. But if there was any doubt, Emily had childishly scrawled a name underneath. Some of the letters were backwards. So we left in the middle of the night, my daughter snuggling restfully against my chest as I carried her from my childhood home. Unlike me, Emily's always been a sound sleeper, so I was able to carry her to the car in her pajamas without waking her. She only stirred when I tucked her into her car seat. Checking the straps, my fingertips brushed her armpits. She was ticklish. We have that in common. She giggled in her sleep, filling me with a fresh wave of dread. As I climbed out of the back seat, I saw a thin silhouette backlit in the doorway. Instantly, I clamped both hands over my mouth and held my breath, but it was only my mother. Closing the car door as quietly as I could, I went back to talk to her. "Honey, where are you going?" she asked, a little scared. "It's the middle of the night." "We have to go," I said. "Uncle Handy was here." She startled. She took a step back from me. She looked over her shoulder to where my father was peering out at us, half hidden behind the curtains with a telephone ready in his hand. Then she repeated the lie she's been telling me for the past 6 years. "You don't, darling, why are you saying this? Come back inside. You know you don't have an Uncle Andy." My tendons stretched. My fingers curled. My dad started dialing. I turned and left quickly. Because I love my mom, and it could have been unpleasant if I'd stayed. Still, I was a live wire of tension on the drive back home. Driving at night always put me on edge. The headlights were low compared to all the signs and electricity poles, lengthening their shadows. Every time high beams popped over the dark highway horizon, I shook so hard I almost lost control of the car. Finally, I decided the safest thing to do was to pull off the freeway and take some of the back roads home, somewhere away from all light. I drove for hours without ever passing another car or so much as a lit window. Without any corners or frightening edges, the moon was the only source of illumination. It was so round and bright and low near the horizon. I turned off my headlights and drove, basked in moonglow, as if in a world unto myself. Winding through the dreamy furrow of that quicksilver dale with my daughter snoring lightly in the back seat, I almost felt peaceful. It happened as suddenly as a spider falling in front of a spotlight. Like a stickety hand, a shadow passed across the moon. Involuntarily, I clamped my hands over my mouth and ran us off the road. It was the lightest of accidents. We ended up in a ditch below a gently sloping hillside. There didn't seem to be damage to the car, but the engine would not turn over. Sweating fiercely, I looked up through the windshield at the golden aperture floating above the hill crescent. The shadows that stroked across it were the feathery tendrils of some cirrus clouds. Like fingers clamping down over a mouth, they smothered out the moon, plunging the valley into darkness thick and cold as sleep. My skin tingled all over. I felt as if I should do something, but I didn't know what. Miraculously, my daughter had not woken during our accident. She still slumbered peacefully in the back, as if drugged. I didn't know where we were. I decided the best thing to do was wait for the dawn. My eyes adjusted themselves to the blackness. As sometimes happens, the contours of the world took on a lightless tangibility, in which they seemed more illuminated by darkness than they ever could have been by the light. The shape of things breathed in the sumptuous blackness, the sloping hillocks, the shivering grass, the psychotropic pinwheels of kaleidoscope stars, and the shape of what I mistook at first to be a grain silo standing atop the hill. But the longer I stared at its silhouette, the more I doubted what it could be. Silos around here are squat, but this structure was senselessly tall. Tall as a skyscraper, perhaps. There was nothing to pin its perspective against before the velveteen backdrop of the night. However tall it was, though, it was crazy with steeples, outcropping turrets that came out of its slender body and upraised, multi-fingered arms. Why would such architecture exist on this lonesome country hill? Then, like a doorway to another world, a rectangle of light slid open across it. And before I even saw his shadow, I knew whose doorway it was. He skittered like a stick insect down the hill. Not on his legs, no. Nothing so top-heavy could be supported by legs that lissome and long-stalked. But with his scurrying, scrabbling fingers, which carried him down towards us like a stick figure galloping astride two stilt-walking tarantulas. He collided with the car like a rolling haystack. I squeezed my eyes shut and threaded my arms through the spokes. My teeth cut through patent leather as I bit down on the steering wheel, all the while silently repeating my mantra. Don't laugh. Don't laugh. Don't ever laugh. The windows were all closed, the car doors locked, but that didn't matter. All around us, hands whipped at the windows like the brushes at a car wash. Soon, I could feel his filigree finger wiggling through the seams, probing the inside of the car and popping the button locks so he could fold himself in like a fractal and use his fingers upon me. But I wouldn't laugh, I told myself. Because being tickled is a state of mind. You can will yourself not to feel the feather-like fingers in your armpits or the sensitive soles of your feet. With deep, hyperventilating breaths, you can train your brain to refuse to translate their touch, to endure it as the violation it is without cheapening it with the lie that it's funny. Because in the release of laughter is the certain knowledge that worse can be done, that Uncle Handy will take it as a permanent invitation. And unlike humor, pain, the pain that comes from having your nerves flayed by filament fingers forever, is not a state of mind. So with his hand clamped around my mouth, I held my breath and bit my tongue, as he long ago taught me. And squeezing out tears until blinking was an aberration, I didn't laugh. But my daughter did. And then she started screaming. So then I laughed, and I thrashed, and I tore his fingers away from Emily's car seat like bristles from a broom. Anything to keep them away from her most tender and vulnerable spots. Anything for him to take me away instead. But it didn't work. His probing digits were innumerable. Where I ripped them off, they grew back immediately, darker and more dexterous than before. They subdued me, finding my every nerve and hollow, stimulating my skin until I was paralyzed in my paroxysms. I couldn't breathe. To the shrieking laughter of my daughter begging for help, I passed out. Sometime near dawn, I awoke. Every muscle sore and screaming, I peeled myself out of the car. Drenched in sweat, my own indentation stayed imprinted in the damp upholstery like the outline of a racked hunchback. My daughter's seat was empty. Heart and throat, I screamed her name over the darkened hills. And then, just for a moment, I saw them. Crepuscular shadows van to black, they stood outlined together in the lit doorway on the crest of the hill. My daughter's writhing body held aloft like a marionette beneath his dancing, thread-like digits. With a laugh like tinnitus rolling down the hills, he waved at me, thus making my daughter wave too. As I began to run towards them, he closed the door between our worlds. Like morning dew, his house melted away before the sunrise. So it's like I keep telling you. If you want to know where Emily is, go out to the country when the moon is large and low. Look for a house outlined on a hill, tall as a skyscraper and crazy with steeples. I think my mother must know how to reach it. Strangle it out of her if you have to. It's the only way I know to make her admit he exists, even if for just a moment. That's what I'd be doing now, if only you would let me go. By now, my daughter's skin will be raw from his fingertips. Her laughter will be keening towards a scream. Her eyes will shine through her body like stars. But there must still be time, so hurry. Search where you found me, crying by the side of the road. That's near where you'll find her, in his house in the country. Because she's with him now. Her great uncle Handy. All right, that is Handy Longlegs by John Brownlee. And this story was first published in Dark Recesses Press, Volume 6, Issue 16. I do thank John Brownlee for allowing me to read this aloud on my show. Appreciate that. The pleasure was all mine. I really fell in love with this story. The first read through, I knew it was exactly what I wanted because it's got a bit of humor, but it's also creepy as heck. As I promised, Beyond Peril, it was sufficiently creepy. If you'd like to learn more about John, you can visit his website at brownl.ee. Just type that in, no .com or anything. And he's got a bit more fiction there, as well as some other information about the kind of stuff that he does. So appreciate that, John, if you're watching or if you're watching later. It was fun. I do have another one of John's tales in the hopper, so we'll play that. I'll read that sometime in the future. But in the meantime, tune in next time for another installment of Stygian Articles. Thank you for spending some time with me tonight. If you've enjoyed this dark fiction, please visit StygianArticles.com for more of my spooky stories and LovecraftTapes.com for fresh episodes of our Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast, which is also creepy and funny, hopefully. If you write horror fiction and would like me to read your work on a future live stream, just visit lovecrafttapes.com and click Contact Us on the menu there. Send me a note. I'll be happy to take a peek at it. And I'll be tickling Beyond Peril for some stimulating tabletop. I am Jeremy, your keeper of arcane lore, wishing you sweet dreams. Good night.